The Great Migration between 1880 and 1970, when over 6 million African Americans moved from the southern states to the north, is one of the most dramatic movements of people within the United States that has ever occurred. And it is almost completely ignored by historians and is unknown to most genealogists. The term Great Migration is used for two different time periods. The first is from Britain to America from 1620 to 1640, and the second refers to the migration from the southern states to the northern states, which began in about 1880 and lasted until about 1970. Understanding the Great Migration may help to explain difficult family history issues that occur when an individual seems to appear suddenly in the north or disappear suddenly from the south. To begin to understand the Great Migration, I must recommend the most influential history of the movement. The book is written as a narrative history and is called The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. This is an essential book for any understanding of the motives, the conditions, the suffering, and the anguish that accompanied this movement. Quoting from Neil Macmillan, as quoted in the book, "The story of the Great Migration is among the most dramatic and compelling in all chapters of American history. So far-reaching are its effects even now that we scarcely understand its meaning." The Great Migration involved the relocation of more than 6 million African Americans from the rural South to the cities of the North, Midwest, and West from about 1880 to 1970, although the first substantial movement began during World War I in 1916. These two maps show the percentage of black population in the United States in 1900 on the left, and the percentage of black population in the states in 1990 on the right. You can see the dramatic expansion of the population out of the southern states by the increase in the colored states in the north and west. The severe economic exploitation of the blacks in the South began during what is known as the Jim Crow era in about 1880. The subsequent passage of extremely complicated segregation laws created a society of terror among the former enslaved people, which included the threat of systematic violence and the complete imposition of political disenfranchisement. These factors made unbearable living conditions for nearly all the formerly enslaved people. Unless you have studied this period of American history, you cannot imagine the degree of poverty and suffering that existed in the black population of the southern states. Unfortunately, many of the black people in America are still suffering the same imposed and limiting conditions. An example of the pervasive terrorism that existed in the South is the fact that between 1880 and 1950, an African American was lynched with impunity of prosecution of the perpetrators more than once a week for some perceived breach of racial hierarchy. Many theories about the conditions in migration involve the incidence of the boll weevil. I remember singing about this little black bug in grade school. Opinions about the impact of the boll weevil on the South vary greatly, but damage caused by this pest was extensive and disruptive. The boll weevil and other economic conditions made sharecrop farming, to which the blacks were subjugated, untenable. Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. The laws were named after a black minstrel show character, and the laws existed for about 100 years, from the post-Civil War era until 1968. These laws were meant to marginalize and oppress African Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, or other opportunities. Those who attempted to defy Jim Crow laws often faced arrest, fines, jail sentences, violence, and death. Escape from the oppression of these laws was a major factor in the movement of the African American population. One tremendous incentive for all immigrants moving north was the promise of increased wages. African Americans in the South were usually paid less than half the amount paid to white workers for the same work. Under the extreme oppression of the Jim Crow laws, many of the smaller farmers were sharecroppers and were charged for everything the landowner could imagine, and often were not paid at all for a year's work. After the Jim Crow laws began to be enacted in the southern states, conditions were worse than during slavery. For both genealogical and sociological reasons, the Great Migration can be divided into two eras: movement associated with World War I and following from 1910 to 1930, and then from 1940 with the advent of World War II, when the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 began to impact the Jim Crow laws. The demand for labor during both world wars accelerated the exodus from the South to the North and West. Migrants during the first phase of the Great Migration traveled to New York, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Chicago. Many of the migrants left under the threat of physical violence or death, and the movement north established a series of safe houses, just as was done during the days of the Underground Railroad. During the period from 1940 to 1970, Southern migrants primarily moved to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, Seattle, and Portland. Unfortunately, the migrants received a similar response to their efforts to obtain housing and education as they had in the South. We begin our research about the migrants following the same basic rule we use for immigrants. Research begins in the place of arrival, not the place of departure. Immigrant research is one of the most challenging aspects of genealogical research. Remember to focus on locations as well as names and dates. You may have to track the families across the country. The basic question is, exactly where did your ancestors come from before they moved north? A first step would be to document the individual or family in each of the years of the United States federal census through 1940. The census schedules might give you an idea about where your ancestors were born. Be sure to look for neighbors and relatives on multiple pages of each year's schedules. City directories are becoming more available online. City directories can be used to trace the movements of families that moved often. Check for draft registration cards for both World War I and World War II. These records give a birth date and a place. They often give information about an employer that can provide further information from employment records, especially records from railroad workers. Draft registration cards also provide the name of a next of kin. As I mentioned above, many African Americans were employed by the railroads. You have to search for records from a specific rail line or railroad, but these records can be valuable. Online Google searches about the Great Migration can result in collections of records that may prove both genealogically valuable and interesting. Take some time to learn about the Great Migration even if you don't have African American ancestors. Your family tree may have been impacted by the movement of so many people. The Family Search Research Wiki has specific pages dedicated to African American genealogy. There are African American pages for each state and many other resources. Here is another example of a page from the Family Search Research Wiki. This page has information and links about African American funeral home records. The African American digital bookshelf in the Family Search Research Wiki has dozens of helpful books listed by category and state. Many of these books are available for free online. Don't forget WorldCat.org, the online free catalog to thousands of catalogs. You can search by author, title, or subject and find the books in libraries near you. This is one of the most valuable research websites online. The Family History Guide is a free website that has a section on ethnic genealogy and has step-by-step instructions about where to begin and continue your research about African American genealogy. Online searches for more information We'll lead you to websites such as this one about the Great Migration at the University of Washington. The National Archives provides additional tools and records for investigating not only the Great Migration, but many other African American topics. Yet another great resource is the Great Migration section of the Digital Public Library of America, or the dp.la. All the resources can be found by searching on the internet. I couldn't possibly list them all in a short video. Be sure and talk to your relatives, but beware of privacy issues. Some people may not want to talk about their past or their bad memories. Also, be careful of not violating cultural norms of the people you contact. Thanks for watching, and be sure to learn as much as you can about research and genealogy.